So you'll recall that this morning, uh, beyond extending that model involving tobacco use and heart disease, we had further started building up a little communicable disease model, a model that exhibited disparities, where people's location within the model was governed by their income, in part, determine their X location. And that, and because of the distribution imposed for incomes within the population, and the fact that connectivity of a transmission network was mediated, indeed dictated, by the proximity of individuals. Persons A and B were connected if and only if they lay within a certain distance, as specified by the properties we indicate in the space and network area of Maine. They had to lie within a certain distance of each other in order to be connected, in which case they would be connected in an undirected connection, so one by which A could transmit to B and B to A. And that simple arrangement induced marked disparities in terms of the density of the contact network. So driven, with poor individuals over here on the left with lower X values being subject to a much denser transmission network, which imposed extra risk for transmission. They're more likely to get infected, given exposure, or they're more likely to get infected by others, and more likely to transmit it to many others if infected. Whereas well-heeled individuals, the individuals who are wealthier, on the other side of the income disparity, with a long tail, often have many fewer connections, with some actually being outside of the sphere of connectivity of that one component, that one giant component to the left, and therefore being immune to the, or unreachable by infection that starts in that component. So in order to see that spread of infection, of course, we had put in place a simple, about as simple as it can get, a communicable disease natural history of infection involving 3 states: susceptible, infective, and recovered in the classic way. Well, someone's chance of recovering from infection was dictated purely by how long they spent in this state, with them leaving after a certain pre-specified amount of time, as dictated by a characteristic of the person. The occurrence of infection, other than that, the initial time, was mediated by them receiving an exposure message. And that exposure message is such that it would have been sent by an individual who is already infected. So an infective individual could pass on this infection, and it could pass it on to others. So when we say pass it on to others, it's sent to their first connections in the network. the people to whom they were directly connected. So they're direct neighbors, they're immediate neighbors in the network. And that induced that infection spread pattern we just saw, where the vast majority of people in the population were initially susceptible, but a small fraction, this proportion initially infected, a parameter that lives in Maine, and is therefore set by scenarios and can be varied across scenarios. It represents, as parameters do, an assumption and communicates that assumption from the point of creation. Point of creation of Maine is scenario, so it communicates that assumption to Maine. And in this case, it was 2% of the population, but that 2% then led to a spread of infection that traveled across that giant component, never reached those really wealthy individuals way to the right, but spread very densely in this connection. But having spread, those individuals recovered in turn and thereby formed a impermeable barrier to any infection through them. And indeed, so many people were infected that the infection died out in that area. So many people are infected and recovered that while it initially spread here from in this giant component and very densely infected everyone, within just a little bit of time longer, people started recovering, and soon it was not sustainable for it to spread. So one of the repeated slogans I've been emphasizing in this bootcamp, one that's very prevalent in system dynamics to good effect, is that structure determines behavior. And there, the references are to multiple types of diagrammatic traditions, including causal loop diagrams, as well as stock and flow diagrams. But that structure applies in general, and it applies just as well to structure and agent-based models, bearing in mind that the structure there is more diverse and exhibits a broader set of building blocks, a broader alphabet, as it were, and extends into other spheres, such as the connectivity between people or spatial location, modes of interaction from one to the other that are discrete, such as one sending another message. Those mechanisms dictate behavior. So what we're going to see is an illustration of this fact. Specifically, we're going to go in and change the structure of this model, structure of our theory, as it were, in terms of the natural history of infection, to allow people to wane in their immunity, to go back from recovered to susceptible. So to do that, we're going to drag in a transition here, leading from recovered to susceptible. And again, as I want, just to show that to you, I like to anchor it on the state whence it will come, regardless of its orientation, because it will reorient appropriately. Drag it to the appropriate rough length, and then I can bend it to my will, according to my aesthetic preferences, by placing these little handles on it and route it to its destination. And I'm going to call this waning of immunity. And it's going to be given by a rate transition. And the rate transition in a pattern we've seen again and again, which is rooted in the mathematical statistics associated with Poisson transitions and exponential dwell time distributions, exponential residence time distribution. The chance per day of leaving that will be 1 divided by immunity duration. Notice those are provided at an individual level to provide us, should we choose to elect to do so, with variability across people, perhaps reflecting different levels of immune system strength and or immunocompromised status, or the occurrence of an intervention that might affect someone's relevant behavior, like with contact patterns, social distancing. So I just built this model. So I've called version 3. And having confirmed that it builds, I'd like to run it. But before we do that, I'm going to ask, how do you think that this change, this modest change of adding this extra transition, might affect things, might affect what we observed in terms of spread of infection? Anyone?
We'll have more cases overall.
We'll have more cases overall, is certainly the case. And no pun intended, and it will keep on circulating. And perhaps that was what was behind your answer. So here we're having spread, and thus far it looks very similar to what we saw before. But now what we're seeing is something quite different. We're seeing, yes, people recover, turning gray in the process, like burnt out ash, but then they're going back because of the waning of immunity to that susceptible status, which allows them to be infected again. And as a result, the infection stays circulating. Profoundly different in its implication. And you notice it's in this perpetual endemic state. And sometimes there are quarters of its network that may recover for long periods of stay recovered and loss of immunity for long periods of time until the infection reaches them, sweeps through them long after they've lost their immunity from the first round. These are sort of the hinterland, and it requires in these thin cuts between them, these thin conduits between them, individuals to have themselves be susceptible so it can percolate along here. And then there could be another round of outbreak here. So we see a transition from a one-time infection sweep on the one hand earlier, without the waning of immunity, to a situation where it remains endemic. And you'll see that it's hotbed of infection. The core of the infection network lies in that left-hand side, and sadly lies with lower income individuals, who too often in our societies bear the brunt of infection and indeed of crowding. So we've seen this modest change of structure, adding a single transition, dramatically changes the induced dynamics. Now, a given individual, before a given individual was infected either one time or 0 times, right? Those folks far to the right have still not even been reached once, these ones out here. So either 0 or 1 time previously. But now a person can be infected any number of times, 0 or more, any natural number of times. I'd like to look at this relationship, if you allow me. I'd like to look at this relationship between income on the one hand and infection count on the other. Hearing no objections, I think we'll move in that direction. But are there any questions of what we've seen thus far before we put in place the core building blocks and hitch them up to look at that relationship between income on the one hand and infection on the other? Any questions about this, about the setup here? Or the interpretation of this model? Okay, not seeing any. Oh, okay. There's a question. Would there be an easy way to include a fold reduction in waning immunity each time someone gets infected? Yes, yes, that could be done, and that would be very interesting. Let's put a pin on that, and we'll explore a bit of new avenues, and then we can come back to it. When you say fold reduction, are you talking about a faster waning of immunity following each infection, as sort of as is might be positive with long COVID, or are you talking about more a long duration of immunity that might result from my immune complement, my T cell populations being further boosted, my precursor skills being in large amounts, and therefore my immune system strength being yet boosted further in ways that would give me longer immunity?
Yeah, I think depends on the pathogen we're talking, but on the second case, I think is probably more common when we continue. Well, at the first stage of like an epidemic, it won't be the same probably and in a second outbreak. That's why I'm trying to kind of.
Yeah, yeah, okay. Yep, yeah, we could come back and look at that. Our ability to do that will be materially sharpened. Or yeah, very, very much so, by having some reporting from this model. So we can do something more than look at its qualitative dynamics in terms of its spread. Rather, we can elicit important insights by looking at relationships, including associational relationships between in general, there will be associational relationships induced by the model's dynamics. And then we could ask, how does what we posit about that, how might that affect those dynamics? So if I may, I'd like to continue on. We'll come back to that as time allows here. And I think time will allow.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so let's stop this recording.